The Andes are a fascinating region any time of year, but go at just the right time and you might catch sight of something particularly magical. Like trees in a northern autumn, you'll see fields of red, orange, yellow, and pink popping up along the mountainsides and high, cold plateaus, fields of quinoa and its relatives. These are plants that throughout history have been vital to many people's survival, these grains that aren't really grains that fed tribes, nations, and empires, provisioned whole armies, and fought off starvation in an often unpredictable environment, long even before the Inca conquered the Andes, back to the early hunter-gatherers. And yet, after the Inca, for centuries these sat in a weird semi-obscurity, seldom mentioned in historical texts, and two were virtually unknown outside the Andes until about half a century ago, before launching into worldwide demand. It's a peculiar trio of plants, and I'll be going through them in order of popularity, from the most famous and trendy to the one with the most confusing history, to the tough-as-nails, half-wild cousin that has only recently started to get some of the recognition it deserves. And for each, I'll talk about one or two ways to eat them that highlight their particular distinctives from the others, in texture or in tradition. So let's start off with by far the most famous one today, at least in the West, quinoa. So at least for a while, this was kind of the stereotypical superfood. To some, it was the healthiest thing since the Fountain of Youth first hit the market and almost a religion in and of itself. To others, it was just another round of marketing baloney drummed up by the nutraceutical industry to prey on gullible bloggers. And, well, there were lots of us in between those two extremes as well. But what is it even, and why this weird roller coaster of popularity? Well, to the first question, despite what it looks like, it's not a grain, in the botanical sense anyway, which only includes fruits of grasses, wheat, corn, rice, etc. Quinoa is not a grass. It's from the Amaranth family, and like spinach, a member of the former goosefoot family, named after the shape of its leaves. But you can use quinoa like a grain, so you can actually trace its rise in popularity by looking at the rise in use of the word pseudo-cereal, meaning fake cereal or fake grain. To try to answer the second question, the rise of quinoa started a long time ago in the Andes, not just once, but apparently multiple times with different people groups in what are today Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, all working to domesticate it over the course of millennia, starting possibly even well before Caral Supe, the earliest known large-scale civilization in the Andes, with some dating the start of this process all the way back to 5000 BC. People started gathering quinoa's wild ancestor, and from that interaction we can see in the archaeological digs that it gradually morphed little bits to become what we know as quinoa today. Now, not all of these people were actually settled farmers at this point. The domesticators in Chile, for instance, appear to have been hunter-gatherers who would regularly come across and revisit patches of wild quinoa on their routes around looking for wild game and resources throughout the year. So, finding this proto-quinoa, they realized this stuff is pretty densely nutritious, filling, and easy to bag and bring with them. And actually one of quinoa's modern drawbacks, the fact that it contains saponins in the outer layer of the seed that need to be processed out of it, that appears to have actually been an advantage for these people. See, it would create extra work for them to eat, like it sometimes does for us today, but it also prevents rodents and insects and other pests from eating these seeds while they're in storage or still sitting on the plant. And it seems that as people shifted from a more nomadic lifestyle to a settled lifestyle and their diet will have shifted to have less meat in it, quinoa seems to have been part of what helped bridge the gap and compensate for that difference in nutrition. So quinoa gradually spread as more people saw its value and adopted it, and by the time of the Inca Empire and the Spanish arrival, it covered a massive area, over 5 modern-day countries, from Ecuador in the north all the way down through Peru and Bolivia to the middle of Chile and a bit of Argentina. For reference on just how large of a stretch that is, if you flip that over the equator and went north instead of south, it would reach from Ecuador all the way up to the southern tip of Canada, same distance from the equator. And we see it show up in archaeological digs of ancient homes, waste piles, burial sites, in ritual vessels, all over the place, showing both food and religious use. Though, interestingly, unlike a lot of other crops, you don't tend to see it in art. A couple sources I read did mention it maybe being in some Tiwanaku ceramic art. but I wasn't able to track down any images. Even the Inca, actually, they considered quinoa sacred. They called it the mother grain, and had a yearly ritual where the Inca emperor would break ground and plant the first quinoa of the season. And similar to the hunter-gatherers, the Inca recognized quinoa was a great traveling food, and storing it up in their sprawling arrays of cold storage houses, it's part of how they managed to feed their massive armies. And yet, I couldn't find any art until after the Inca period, like that one I just showed there. Puzzling. Whatever the reason for that, though, quinoa was quite important, but after the Spanish came, a lot of stuff started to change. The Spanish did not look on quinoa favorably, and opinions unfortunately shifted against many of the local crops, including quinoa, coming to see them as low-class peasant food, and shifted in favor of crops the Spanish brought with them, such as wheat and barley. Fortunately, not completely, and many indigenous farmers did continue to grow quinoa and other local crops as subsistence crops just to feed their own families. One chronicler, Garcilaso de la Vega, does mention trying to bring some quinoa back to Europe, which might have led to something, but none of those seeds sprouted, so the chance of interest there evaporated. And for the most part, that was that for about 4 whole centuries. There were a few isolated experiments here and there, but from then in the mid-1500s to the middle of the 1900s, quinoa was almost entirely unheard of and unknown outside the Andes. Obviously, today it is very different. So, what changed? Well, 20th century, lots of advancements in industrial agriculture, but researchers were also beginning to worry about a trend of narrowing down on just a small handful of crops to grow en masse. And so they had begun re-examining traditional crops from around the world to try and keep options open. And quinoa was one of the big rediscoveries. Why? Well, people noticed a few things. First, it's very nutritious for a grain. It's higher than most in quite a few vitamins and minerals, but most famously for its protein quality. See, it's important to get not only enough protein in one's diet, but also the right types of protein. Proteins are built from different combinations of smaller amino acids, and there's 9 of these amino acids our bodies can't make on their own. So we need to get them instead from the different proteins we eat. But not all proteins are created equal. For instance, most true grains are low in the amino acid lysine. Legumes, on the other hand, famously high in protein, tend to have decent lysine, but low methionine, which grains do often have. Hence, part of why rice and beans is a good combination. Meat tends to have all the vital ones, but meat's not always in ready supply. Think our post-hunter-gatherer friends from earlier settling down. And things like beans can take a lot of fuel to cook. Hard when you live above the tree line. Fortunately, though, quinoa and the other 2 in this video tend to have all the essential amino acids, making them a complete protein, and they're quick to cook. So good for eating, but also for growing. And that huge geographical spread means that quinoa will grow in a lot of different conditions, from the salty highland semi-deserts in Bolivia down to the more moist, temperate regions around Chile's Chiloé Island, so that you get a huge variety of varieties to choose from when you're trying to grow it elsewhere, including ones that do well in hot, cold, dry, and salty conditions. And salty is becoming a problem in a lot of parts of the world today. Now, this isn't a flawless crop. As mentioned, there is that whole issue of saponins in the outer layers. Maybe if you've cooked quinoa before, you've seen instructions telling you to rinse or wash the quinoa first to get those out. Often it is actually pre-washed if you buy it here, or it might be from one of the new varieties that contain little to no saponins to begin with. To remove the saponins commercially, typically they're first mechanically hulled, which takes out most of the saponins, and then washed, and then dried. It's not a complicated process, just kind of time consuming and uses a lot of water, which is part of why this stuff isn't cheap to get here. And it does leave you with a lot of saponin containing wastewater. But it turns out those saponins do have some potential uses themselves if they can be collected. Detergent and insecticide, unsurprisingly, and also molluscicide, attacking snails that can be pests in rice paddies, but also stuff like as an addition to medicines to help the body absorb them better sometimes, or adding them to certain vaccines in order to stimulate the body's immune system response towards attacking the threat contained in the vaccine. Also as preservatives, to remove cholesterol from dairy was another one. There's quite a few things. So we'll see how dominant the saponin-less varieties become if it becomes economically worthwhile to collect those saponins. But anyway, once saponins are out of the picture, how can you use quinoa? What sets it apart from the other two here? Well, when I was trying to think what to show for this, I ran into a slight problem. A quick Googling for quinoa recipes will find you thousands of pages, but very few are the sort that you, or at least I, look at and go, wow, where's that from? Or what is that interesting dish? Quinoa has a lot of uses, but a lot of them look less like quinoa dishes specifically, but more just like grain dishes that happen to use quinoa, but you could just as easily use rice or barley or couscous, which it's not that that's bad, but I'm trying to show distinctives here. And to be fair, I think much of quinoa's hype is more about its nutritious attributes and gluten-free status than its culinary applications. But that said, I think that is actually where this one shines. It's been called the rice of the Incas for good reason, and it stands out from the other two on this list in that when you cook it, it keeps its shape, doesn't mush, and has decently large grains. Also, to me, of these three, I think this one has the best flavor for if you're just eating it plain. So all those three things together, I think a great dish to show this off would be a dish like tabbouleh, this Middle Eastern salad of herbs, olive oil, lemon, tomato, and grain, traditionally often coarsely ground wheat. I think that's actually been my favorite use for quinoa, grain salads like that. And you can find Andean examples like that. The texture of the quinoa is nice, loose but meaty, a little bit nutty, and then it blends well with the other flavors there too. Now, if you want to try a dish that's a little more distinctively Andean and not just a general grain dish, I might point you instead to quinoa atamalada. Atamalada means like a tamale, but this is basically a really thick cheese and quinoa stew. So thick that if done right, you can mold it into shapes like this. I'll link the recipe I used in the description, but there are many variations on this recipe out there. Oh, and I did also try incorporating it as the bottom layer of something loosely inspired by Peruvian causa limeña, very loosely. Was the result authentically Andean? I don't think so. Do I regret making it though? Not in your wildest dreams. No, that was delicious. Oh, and final thought, if you're into that sort of thing, you could also try making quinoa-based alcohol. That I've never tasted it, but it is a traditional thing in the Andes. So, and if you have any other good suggestions for quinoa uses, do let me know in the comments. Anyway, on to the next pseudo-cereal. Different genus this time, but same family and somewhat similar looking seeds. This is Amaranth, specifically a type of amaranth called foxtail amaranth, Kiwicha, or sometimes in English, love lies bleeding. Quite the name, but if you're a gardener, it might be a familiar one as an ornamental. English folk around the Victorian era apparently gave it that name because they were big on using different flowers as symbols for sending messages and writing poems, and this one has that sad, drooping shape like streams of blood being poured out, so they thought it lent itself well to mournful themes, as you can see in a number of poems from the era. Did the Andeans view it similarly? Well, I'm not sure, because you run into a bit of a problem here. This was definitely an important crop in a large area in the Andes, widely cultivated, widely consumed, but we don't actually know much about the historical, cultural side with these. See, when the Spanish arrived, some of their chroniclers made records of the various crops that the Inca and nearby peoples grew, and quinoa definitely gets recorded in those. But as far as these Andean pseudo-cereals go, that's about it. No real mention of the other two. Was it disinterest or confusion? These plants were clearly there. I found one example of a botanist in 1601 giving a scientific description of quinoa, but then when you look at his drawing, you realize, no, this is Kiwicha or Amaranth. And the chronicler Bernabe Cobo, you see him talking about quinoa, and his rough description sounds plausibly like quinoa, but he also says it's similar to bledos back in Europe, which could possibly be a goosefoot like quinoa, but more typically means amaranth. It seems early on the Spanish may have just been referring to all three of these plants here as quinoa. And to be fair, if you just see the grains, they do look fairly similar. Now, we do have more clear historical information when it comes to some of Kiwicha's close relatives, other species of amaranth, up north with the Aztecs in what is today Mexico, and the Spanish did take distinct note of it there. For the Aztecs, those other amaranths were major staples and a lot more clearly prominent in terms of cultural prestige. It was one of their most important crops, comparable to corn, and it featured both as a main calorie source and a religious symbol used in rituals. That said, amaranth did drastically dwindle up there too, especially because the Spanish banned it, due to the fact that some of those rituals it was involved in purportedly contained using it as part of their human sacrifice rituals, where they would mix amaranth flour with human blood, mold it into shapes of animals or gods, and then eat them. It's quite the situation. But I can't shake the thought that banning it as a food source was... I'm trying to think of the appropriate expression, but throwing the baby out with the bathwater just feels jarringly mild when you're talking about human sacrifice. But I am curious too whether that whole issue might have colored the Spanish perception of amaranth when they eventually came down to the Andes as well, even though the Andean peoples didn't elevate amaranth in the same way. All that said, amaranth did eventually make a resurgence as a crop in Mexico and also overseas as an ornamental and as a crop. But that's where its history gets a bit mysterious. When you read about the grain amaranths, there's really no disagreement that they come originally from the Americas. But there is some disagreement on when they spread to the rest of the world, particularly Asia, with some suggesting it may have even been before Columbus, as in way before Columbus, maybe even BC times. Now, that may sound conspiratorial, but it wouldn't actually be the first crop where this sort of thing sounds like a plausible explanation. So that's sort of a topic for another video, but it's not outside the realm of consideration, and it's worth looking at the evidence we have. So I didn't do a real deep dive into this topic, but you can find a good little breakdown of the current arguments for and against an early timeline in this source, which I'll link in the description. But to summarize the common early transfer arguments, people have noted first in Asia that there are a plethora of local and Sanskrit names for grain amaranths, suggesting that they've been there for quite a while. Number two, one researcher reported finding seeds in an ancient Indian dig dating back into BC times. And three, another researcher noted an entry in an old Chinese herbal seeming to match these grain amaranths. The article responds to the latter 2 points, noting at the Indian site, the original author didn't actually claim that identification. He more just listed several modern-day local plants that appeared similar to the seed remains, and two of his suggestions happened to be from the Americas. And the Chinese herbal, they argue the description sounds actually more like one of the other locally native amaranths, not one from the Americas, especially since it describes them having black seeds, which would be quite unusual for the grain amaranths. So I'm inclined to believe a later date may be brought over by the Dutch, but we'll see where further evidence leads on this one. In any case, amaranth has been well incorporated into local dishes and farming practices for a fair while now in India, China, and a number of nearby countries. I had someone comment on another video of mine actually saying they were surprised to learn that amaranth wasn't native to India. And fair enough, India has some pretty dry regions, and that turns out to be one of amaranth's specialties. But while Kiwicha is a highland plant like quinoa, it doesn't go quite as high, so it leans a little bit less into cold tolerance and a bit more into heat, and notably also drought, bolstered by the fact that, unlike quinoa, Amaranth is a C4 plant, meaning it uses a slightly different process for doing photosynthesis in a way that allows a lot less gas and water vapor to exit the leaves, actually only about a quarter as much as a more typical C3 plant would lose. Being a C4 plant doesn't guarantee this level of drought tolerance, but it's one factor that helps. So it can thrive in the really dry areas, including today in parts of India and Africa, which is great because, once again, this is a fantastically nutritious grain. Great quality protein again, high calcium, phosphorus, potassium, iron, zinc, B and E vitamins. It's got a nutritional profile that some compare favorably with milk itself, leading it to be recommended as a food for babies and pregnant and nursing mothers, especially in poorer areas where the diet might otherwise be a bit more nutritionally deficient. Again, lots of different preparations you can make with these, and I haven't personally noticed much of any difference between Kiwicha and the Mesoamerican grain amaranths, so they should be pretty interchangeable. Cooked plain, or if you happen to eat them raw, I don't think that's recommended, but they do have a bit of a distinctive taste then. I've heard some describe it as mousy, which I think actually does kind of fit. It's a peculiar taste, but it then depends how you use them. They do happen to puff quite well. So Quinoa does this too, actually, but this one's easier to do at home, and there's no worry about saponins. It comes out kind of like tiny popcorn. To me, kind of tastes halfway between popcorn and puffed wheat. But you can eat it plain or in salads or mix them with honey to make sort of candy energy bars called alegria in Mexico. I'll link the recipe I used for this down below. But to me, it tastes a lot like something between a puffed wheat cake and a Rice Krispie cake. Obviously, it depends what you put in the syrup and if you add nuts or any other things like that. But again, amaranth also makes a good flour made into sweets, puddings, in soups, mixed into breads, used as breading for meat. So what is distinctive when cooking with these ones? Well, I was considering choosing popped amaranth for this section. That alegria was quite nice, but I think my personal favorite feature with these is this. Compared to quinoa, these don't keep their grains separate when you boil them. These ones mush. As they cook, they will much more readily glom together and turn into a porridgey mass, which also means you can make crackers. These have been sitting out and have lost some of their crunch, but this idea I actually got from a North American indigenous-inspired cookbook, which I've linked below. So I'm not certain if they make something quite like these in the Andes. Couldn't find anything equivalent, but if not, they are missing out. They are very simple to make and very nice crackers. Basically, all you need to do is combine 1 cup amaranth, 3 cups water, and a few pinches of salt. Simmer that until it becomes a thick, doughy porridge. Mix in a tablespoon of oil. Spread that out thinly on a baking sheet. Stick it in the oven at 300, that's Fahrenheit. And then bake that until they're firm. If you get the timing just right, you've got a nice, easy, crispy, nutty tasting cracker. Simple snack, very few ingredients. Oh, and I did also want to make a slightly more Andean-inspired version, so I threw in some ají amarillo paste into some of them, which was not bad. Anyway, a tough plant with a nutritious grain that was once obscure, but now for the most tough, obscure, and nutritious of the three. This is Kaniwa. Yes, it sort of sounds like I'm pronouncing a misspelling of quinoa, and the two are very close relatives. You may have trouble telling them apart at a glance, and it wasn't even until 1929 that it was recognized as a distinct species from quinoa. And so it's not too surprising that, again, the early sources don't distinguish the two. But it is distinct. I mentioned maca in a previous video, a peculiar tasting, potential male enhancement root vegetable crop of the high mountain tundra that some sources called the hardiest high elevation crop in the world. Well, this one may be the one crop that gives maca a run for its money. This is quinoa's tough as nails, half-wild cousin. So quinoa and kiwicha, no question, those are hardy and tough. But they have their limits. Kiwicha tends to stop growing well around 3,600 meters elevation, and quinoa, even the really specialized varieties, will tend to top out around 4,000 meters, just above Lake Titicaca, the center of the Tiwanaku civilization. And it's already quite cold up there. The snowy peaks are in close view, and temperatures are frequently in the single digits Celsius. Kaniwa continues upward for another 400 meters, or 1,300 feet, possibly even a bit more if it's grown in a sheltered area. To give some rough visualization compared to some famous high elevation landmarks in Peru, that would be roughly this high above Umantai Lake, or around here on the approach to Vinicunca, Peru's famous Rainbow Mountain. Though, of course, the shape of the landscape itself will make a huge difference whether crops can actually be grown there, regardless the exact elevation. So when I say these things are tough, I'm talking things like being able to survive freezing nearly nightly, maybe even down as low as minus 10 degrees Celsius for months, and not just to go dormant, but to actually just wait for morning each day when it thaws and then continue growing in the daytime. And then dealing with salt and drought and fierce wind and harsh sun and hail, at least before flowering. And this is not some woody perennial or something. This is a scraggly little herbaceous annual. So how does it do all that? Well, it's got a bunch of mechanisms going on, and some are shared with Kiwicha and with quinoa to an extent, but quinoa just takes this combination to a whole nother level. To name a few, for freeze resistance, these plants have flexible cell membranes, so as water expands as it freezes, their cells won't get damaged. You have leaves being able to fold and cover the more sensitive flower head for night to shelter it. On the flip side, the harsh tropical sunlight is mitigated by having leaves folded and at less direct angles to the sun with little calcium oxalate crystals in them reflecting excess sun away so you can get only the amount of sunlight you actually need. You have small leaves giving less area for hail to damage and less surface area for the wind to whip it around with, and growing down lower to the ground, also to be out of the wind. And if it does happen to lose its leaves, even that, no problem, because the stem can take over doing photosynthesis. It's a long list, and there's a bunch of other features too, but somehow, even with all that, this isn't just an emergency backup food. Somehow through all that, it produces a pretty decent quantity of food, and in many ways, even a bit more nutritious than quinoa. It's no wonder this has carried some cultural symbolism of persistent good health and prosperity for how it produces and even persists, even under some really difficult conditions. For instance, this sometimes gets scattered in newlyweds' homes. So, unsurprisingly, this plant has a history, just not a particularly well-documented history, unfortunately. It does seem to have been grown over a much wider area before the Spanish came. Today, it's only grown in a relatively small area in the high mountains of Peru and Bolivia, especially around Lake Titicaca, which archaeologically is where we see it in most prominence, in sites from the Chiripa, Chipaya, and Tiwanaku peoples, as well as the Inca. And Kaniwa is credited as being a key part of how people survived at these elevations, and providing, like today for some farmers, a safety net sort of where, even if all your other crops fail, Kaniwa is still there. Hence, too, why it was a great crop for farmers to grow just as a weed amongst their other crops in their fields. All that said, this plant does have some quirks, some for better and some for worse when it comes to growing them. And that is because this plant is only half domesticated. Now, what does it mean for a plant to be domesticated? It's not just like taming an animal. Well, a flyby summary would be kind of this. There are a lot of growth patterns that work well for plants in a wild setting, but not so well in a field. And usually over time, as people harvest and replant a plant, it will shift in favor of those latter traits. Maybe tastier, larger fruits, but also things like all of the grains being mature around the same time, so the harvest is simpler, or the seeds sprouting more quickly, so they can outcompete weeds when the field is first planted. Another big one with grains and seed crops is shattering. A wild grain, once the seed is mature, doesn't usually have much reason to stay on the plant, so will often fall off or shatter as soon as it's ripe. From a human harvesting point of view, that is not very helpful. But which grains will get successfully harvested and replanted? Probably the ones that are easiest to harvest in the first place, which would be the ones that stay on the plant. But that doesn't always happen. Case in point, these things shatter when they're ripe. Now, in this one's case, you can get around that by going and cutting the Kaniwa just before the grains are actually ripe. Then leave them to mature and dry for a couple weeks and thresh and winnow and then use. So this isn't too bad for the small-scale harvesting that's done, but it does make large-scale harvesting trickier. So this is something that's being investigated and worked on in breeding programs. Oh, to note, these pictures are actually of traditional quinoa harvest here. The process is pretty similar apart from the extra early cutting, but it was just harder to find pictures of Kaniwa being harvested. So that whole shattering thing has been one of the factors limiting Kaniwa's spread as a crop. Also, though, these things aren't as competitive against weeds or insect pests. They don't have to be at those high elevations, just not as many plants and insects can live up there. On the plus side, there actually, though, less insects means these things tend to have little to no saponins for defending against them. But these have come to be a crop of interest for people in really marginal lands where nutritious crops can be very hard to grow. Places like high mountain tundra, arid deserts. This has shown some surprising success on Peru's coastal deserts already. But as far as food value goes, these are in a lot of ways like a slightly more nutritious version of quinoa, including in its mineral content and amino acids. These are being looked at for use with school nutrition programs and to help in poorer areas, and they're a good backup livestock feed as well, both the seeds and the plants. As to the more limited uses, though, if you look online, you will find a lot of places advocating using it just like quinoa, even calling it baby quinoa and boiling it as such. And that is true. You can do that. Use it in salads, soups, etc. Similarly, it has a texture closer definitely to quinoa than amaranth. It doesn't form a sticky porridge, but the grains are also much smaller and stay a bit less distinct than with quinoa. In terms of bite, it's actually slightly unique in that even if you fully cook it boiled, it will retain a slight bit of a nice crunch. The taste is closer to quinoa, though I would say a bit more distinctive, a slight edge to it in a way that, to my mind, is a bit harder to pair with some things. I've never seen this recommended, but I did personally try just putting some of this stuff raw into pancake batter and cooking pancakes that way. It was kind of nice, but it was also kind of like having really crunchy poppy seeds in your pancakes, which actually, okay, growing up with a lot of Czech desserts, that doesn't actually sound too bad. But if you look at sources on traditional uses for Kaniwa, though, you won't actually see a whole lot mentioning boiling them like quinoa. Most often, it seems, Kaniwa was toasted and then ground into a flour called, amongst other names, Kaniwako or Pito de Kaniwa. It's hard to find Kaniwako outside the Andes, but fortunately, it's not hard to make at least a rough approximation. Just toast the seeds in a pan until they start to smell toasty and fragrant, then grind it up. It may take some trial and error. I may have gone a bit on the dark roast side with this batch, and a lot of mine popped in the process, but the result tasted pretty good. How to describe it exactly, though? If I didn't know what this was, I don't think I would guess it was something grain-like. It's, to me, it smells a lot more like maybe roasted peanuts and roasted pumpkin seeds with kind of some notes of chocolate and coffee, I think. Like, it will depend how darkly you roast it, obviously. Texture-wise, it is a little bit gritty, but that will also depend how finely you're able to grind it. I couldn't go that fine just in my spice grinder. And depends what you do with it, because if you add warm water to this, it very quickly softens it and takes out the grit. Now, as a travel survival food, this stuff is fantastic. No need to carry a pot with you or enough water to cook it in or even fuel for a fire. It's already cooked. You just have a dense, imperishable, high nutrition powder. A common way to use this historically would be to just add a little bit of water to this and make it into sort of a dough ball you could take with you, which I made one here. And it just kind of tastes like a toasty flatbread. I added a bit of salt, but yeah, not bad. I mean, it's fairly plain, but not bad at all. You could always cook that dough ball further into a dumpling or into a flatbread. Add a bit more water to that, and you have a porridge. Add sugar and milk, and you've got pudding or a hot drink similar to hot chocolate. Or maybe I would say it's a bit closer to Mexican tascalate, which is a chocolate and roasted corn-based drink. At least compared to the tascalate I've made at home. I haven't tasted authentic stuff before. I experimented a bit with the puddings angle here, trying to add different fruit pastes or powders I had lying around my home, and a lot of things actually paired really nicely with it as a pudding. Lucuma was quite nice, this Andean fruit, and the Kaniwako flavor actually covered over that bit of cigarette edge to the flavor of lucuma. If you're confused by that description, see my earlier video. Another good one, stinking toe fruit powder, was also good in a very different way. The chocolatey flavors pairing with the bright jackfruit notes in its flavor. I think my favorite one, though, was actually choke cherries. I think the dark, complex sweetness they had paired really well with the toasty, slightly chocolatey flavor of the Kaniwa. And I think there's probably a lot of other fruits that would pair well here. I'm not usually much of a fruit pudding guy, but this was good. I don't think this is traditional, but I did try making a spread out of Kaniwa too to see if it could make something like peanut butter, adding a bit of oil and salt. The results tasted nice, kind of like a very mild, slightly more savory peanut butter, but the grittiness was there, and I would need to experiment further with this. Oh, and of course you can always just use some of this to replace a bit of wheat flour in bread or pancakes or something like that to raise the nutrition a bit and give it a nice, nutty, toasty flavor. In the end, I think my favorite use for this stuff so far has been either the fruit puddings or the beverage that was kind of like tasca latte. Just nice and rich, and it's also nice knowing it's more wholesome than a lot of puddings I might otherwise eat. So, if you happen to have any more recipes for Kaniwa or Kaniwako or any of the other pseudo cereals in this video, do let me know. I've started experimenting with these more recently, and I've liked what I've tried so far. But in any case, thank you for liking and subscribing. Thank you to those who support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships. I have a little bit of bonus content over there. And for more plants, weird and wonderful, mundane and strange, join me next time on Ambling with Sam.